Hello, human geographers. We are back at it again this evening. Tonight, we're going to examine the three major agricultural revolutions. So let's begin with the first agricultural revolution, which dates back 10,000 years, and it was achieved through plant domestication and animal domestication, and was also known as the Neolithic Revolution. So the first agricultural revolution was about plant and animal domestication. So what is that? Domestication is the successful transformation of plant and animal species from a wild state to a condition of dependency on human management, usually with distinct physical changes from wild forebears. These plants and animals require humans to take care of them. We plant them, we raise them, feed them, water them, and they likely would not survive without our care. And with the rise of plant and animal domestication, humans shifted from being hunter-gatherers to farmers. And we see the rise of agriculture, which is the deliberate effort to modify a portion of Earth's surface through the cultivation of crops and the raising of livestock for sustenance or economic gain. So now that we know our key terms, let's examine how all this came to be. Hunter-gatherer societies were limited to relatively small bands of people whose numbers were limited by the availability of food. A tribe might have 30 to 50 people because anything larger would have likely exceeded the carrying capacity. Generally, men did the hunting, while women gathered wild plants and fruits. Then, around 9 to 10,000 BCE, a process began to occur. Humans began to domesticate wild plants and animals. Humans began to intentionally plant, breed, care for, and protect these wild plants and animals. This occurred gradually, with lots of trial and error that eventually led to plants and animals that were genetically different from their wild ancestors. They were larger, better tasting, less aggressive, and more productive. The domestication of plants and animals led to the rise of agriculture, where humans began to cultivate or care for plants and animals rather than searching for them. As humans shifted to agriculture, other changes began to occur. While hunter-gatherers were small bands of nomadic people dispersed over the landscape, early agriculturalists came to be settled in more densely populated, sedentary farming communities, usually along rivers. These permanent communities led to the emergence of urban societies. Those eventually became the first civilizations. The stable food supply allowed some members of these new civilizations to specialize in jobs other than growing food. So we saw full-time blacksmiths and carpenters, soldiers and religious leaders. And with the emergence of specialists, new technologies were created and new innovations implemented. So where did this all begin? Carl Sauer, a leading expert on the origins of agriculture, believed that plant domestication occurred in multiple regions of great biodiversity, where many different kinds of wild plants grew. Importantly, most geographers now agree that there were several independent herds of agriculture, where people domesticated plants and animals that were local to their region. In fact, there are generally 5 or 6 independent herds, and we're going to look at each hearth individually. A note for the AP exam: they expect students to know where certain prominent crops originated. So be sure to make note of that. Let's start in the Middle East, specifically a region known as the Fertile Crescent, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The Fertile Crescent domesticated grains like wheat, barley, oats, and rye, as well as grapes, apples, and olives, and animals like sheep, goats, cattle, as well as camels. In East Asia, in what is modern China between the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, rice and soybeans were first domesticated. In South Asia, the Indus River Valley civilization domesticated a form of dry rice as well as strains of wheat. It was also one of the 3 herds for the domestication of cattle. In Southeast Asia, taro, yams, and bananas were prominent food plants. Sugarcane was also domesticated here. As far as animals, it's believed that several kinds of pigs, water buffalo, chickens, and some waterfowl like ducks and geese were first domesticated in Southeast Asia. Next is Africa. East and West Africa gave us peanuts, yams, and coffee. Sorghum, a grain that is still prominent in Africa, was domesticated in Central Africa. Lastly, the Americas. Maize, or corn, as well as tomatoes, squash, and several varieties of bean were first domesticated in what is now central Mexico, while potatoes were domesticated in the northern Andes of modern Peru. Domesticated animals of the Americas included the llama, alpaca, guinea pig, and turkey. And agricultural technology gradually diffused from these early herds over time. For example, through contagious diffusion, hunter-gatherer groups that were near agricultural societies were exposed to farming techniques and soon adopted them. Then, the movement of people to new locations spread agriculture via relocation diffusion. But beginning in the 15th and 16th centuries, a new pattern of diffusion emerged. It came to be known as the Columbian exchange. In 1492, Columbus made contact with the Americas, touching off the exchange of crops, disease, people, and ideas between the Americas, West Africa, and the Old World. The relocation diffusion of crops and seeds was greatly accelerated by worldwide trade and communication networks that were established by European exploration and colonialism. These plants and animals were relocated to new regions with climate and geography similar to those of the point of their domestication. So New World crops like potatoes, chili peppers, tomatoes, cacao, maize, and tobacco were brought from the Americas to Europe, Asia, and Africa. Old World crops such as sugarcane, coffee, soybeans, oranges, and bananas were brought to the Americas. And while these plants and animals were relocated to new areas, so too were diseases. Influenza and smallpox were particularly devastating to indigenous Americans who had never encountered them before. So millions of indigenous Americans died after contact with Europeans. So make sure you're able to understand the historical and contemporary impacts of the Columbian exchange. Many large plantations were formed in the Americas to grow sugarcane, coffee, and bananas for export to markets in the Old World. And because these plantations were labor intensive, many workers were needed. And because so many indigenous people died due to disease and conflict, Europeans brought huge numbers of enslaved Africans to the Americas to harvest these raw materials for export. Even now, we can see the impacts of the Columbian exchange. Coffee and bananas, originally from Old World herds, continue to thrive in the tropical climate of the Americas. And crops like maize continue to thrive in Europe, Asia, and Africa, as well as the Americas. And a lot of the historical and cultural associations we have with food stem from the Columbian exchange. There is no Irish potato famine without the Columbian exchange, as potatoes were first domesticated in South America. And perhaps the most prominent animals associated with the American diet, cattle and chickens, aren't native to the Americas. Shifting gears now, let's examine the second agricultural revolution, which was a period of technological change from the 1600s to mid-1900s that started in Western Europe, beginning with pre-industrial improvements such as crop rotation and better horse collars, and concluding with industrial innovations to replace human labor with machines and to supplement natural fertilizers and pesticides with chemical ones. The Second Agricultural Revolution preceded, contributed, and coincided with the Industrial Revolution, which is an important note to make. One of the aspects of the Second Agricultural Revolution that preceded the Industrial Revolution was crop rotation, the practice of rotating the use of different fields from crop to crop each year to avoid exhausting the soil. And the four-field system of crop rotation emerged during the Second Agricultural Revolution. Part of the traditional system of crop rotation was leaving fields fallow. That is, land that was previously cultivated that has been left unseeded for a season or more. So let's take a look at how all this worked. The Second Agricultural Revolution began in the 1600s and continued through the late 1800s. It initially began in Great Britain, the Netherlands, Denmark, and other neighboring countries, but quickly diffused throughout Europe and some of its colonies like the Americas. This revolution was centered on advancements in planting or sowing of seeds, as well as the reaping or harvesting of crops. At the same time, there were improvements in storage, irrigation, and transportation. The new crops that came into Europe from trade with the Americas, including corn and potatoes, were well suited for the climate and soils of Western Europe, bringing land that was previously considered marginal or unproductive into cultivation, thereby expanding the amount of arable land. The Second Agricultural Revolution saw agricultural activities shift toward making profit, what we call commercial agriculture. So farmers began to increase their investments to try and maximize the output from their farms. This led to increased agricultural productivity. A political reason for the increase in productivity was the passage of a series of laws called the Enclosure Acts in Great Britain. This allowed farmers to buy land from the government. This increased the size of farms, and farmers began to fence in or enclose their land. As farmers owned larger tracts of land, they changed how they used that land. Profit-driven farmers began to use artificial fertilizers to increase productivity. And as the Second Agricultural Revolution overlapped with the Industrial Revolution that began in Great Britain in the 18th century, new technologies were developed. More agricultural work was mechanized. When combined with the loss of land due to the Enclosure Acts, many poor peasant farmers were forced out of agriculture, and many moved to urban areas, serving as the workforce in the emerging industrial or secondary sector. Farmers began to utilize a more sophisticated crop rotation system that increased agricultural output. Root crops, like turnips, were planted and served as fodder for the growing animal population. In addition, while fields were previously left fallow or unplanted to rest and regenerate nutrients, the four-field system used rest crops, like clover, to actually increase the amount of nutrients provided to the soil. Since the Second Agricultural Revolution coincided with the Industrial Revolution, let's examine some of the new technologies that helped to increase agricultural production. The seed drill was used for planting seeds. It sowed the seeds by shooting them directly into freshly dug holes, thereby increasing efficiency and decreasing waste. Early plows were developed to break up and turn over soil before planting, but John Deere developed a steel plow that was stronger and lighter. The mechanical reaper was developed by Cyrus McCormick to help harvest grains. It both cut and bundled the grains and helped to increase yields at least 10 times. The tractor, when powered by the internal combustion engine of the later Industrial Revolution, helped to increase efficiency and further reduce the amount of manual labor that was needed on farms. In addition to new inventions, there were new ways to help fertilize the soil. Previously, animal manure, ashes, and decayed organic material were used to improve the soil. But by the 1800s, new agrochemicals were being developed. These new synthetic fertilizers were made from petroleum byproducts and helped to increase the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium contents in the soil. New developments in transportation also helped to improve agricultural production. The opening of the Erie Canal in 1825 allowed farmers to transport non-perishable products such as wheat or corn for a fraction of the cost and in a fraction of the time. Railroads made it cheaper to transport produce and grain crops from farms to city markets as well as ports. They also made it more efficient to get cattle to market. Railroads also made new areas more economically viable for agriculture, such as the interior Great Plains region of the United States. And once the refrigerated train car was introduced in 1867, U.S. farmers could ship perishable foods such as meat over larger distances, reaching city populations quickly. So what was so revolutionary about new inventions, laws, and agricultural practices? Well, farms became larger and production became more efficient, so producers began to raise crops that generated the greatest surplus so they could sell their crops for profit. New mechanical innovations and advancements helped to generate those surpluses. At the same time, these advancements led to a decreasing need for farm labor to plant and harvest the crops. Many unemployed farm laborers migrated to the cities to work in factories, as did small farmers who could not compete with the larger, more profitable landowners. So rural areas and farming communities experienced a population loss as increasing numbers of people migrated to urban areas. Those huge surpluses of food were needed to feed that growing urban population, who in turn provided more labor for the factories of the Industrial Revolution. More food meant a decline in things like malnutrition. Better diets led to falling death rates and healthier, longer lives, which in turn led to the rapid population growth that is associated with this time period and the transition to stage 2 of the demographic transition. The expanding population increased the pool of available workers, but it also affected the urban infrastructure, causing increased demand for water, problems with sanitation, a housing shortage, and increased the wealth and opportunity gap between workers and management. We'll finish tonight up with the Green Revolution, which was the recently successful development of higher yield, fast-growing varieties of rice and other cereals in certain developing countries, which led to increased production per unit of area and a dramatic narrowing of the gap between population growth and food needs. The Green Revolution was all about high-yield varieties, HYV, high-yield varieties, of certain grain crops like rice, wheat, and corn. The Green Revolution was a portion of, but is sometimes used as, a synonym for the Third Agricultural Revolution, which is currently in progress. The Third Agricultural Revolution has as its principal orientation the development of genetically modified organisms, or GMOs. One of the ways that those high-yield varieties of grains were created was through hybridization and genetic modification. So genetically modified organisms are crops that carry new traits that have been inserted through advanced genetic engineering methods, often through a combination of DNA from similar plant or animal species. So now that we know our key terms, let's take a look at the details. The third agricultural revolution technically began in the 1930s, but includes the Green Revolution of the 1960s and 1970s. It began in core countries like the United States and United Kingdom, and diffused primarily to semi-periphery countries like India and Mexico. The focal point of the Green Revolution was increasing the productivity of existing arable land. And that was accomplished through three things: the development of high-yield seeds, the increase of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, and increased irrigation and mechanization. The development of high-yield seeds initially began with hybridization. In an increasingly globalized world, farmers had a wider range of plants from which to crossbreed than did local farmers earlier in history. By crossbreeding different varieties of wheat, rice, or corn, agriculturalists were able to produce strains that yielded more food per acre and grew faster. By the 1960s and 70s, scientists took this further and created genetically modified organisms. Through the use of biotechnology, scientists could alter specific segments of DNA or transfer genes not only between species, but also between plants and animals. The genetic modification could produce new properties like better response to fertilizer or resistant to disease, drought, or pesticides. As with hybrid seeds, GMO varieties were developed for the major cereal grains like wheat and rice. Later, GMO varieties of corn, soybeans, cotton, cassava, among others, were developed. By the 1990s, GMO seeds became widely used. The genetic modification led to increased use of fertilizers and pesticides, particularly in the developing countries where the Green Revolution had the greatest impact. We also saw massive irrigation projects, including the construction of dams, irrigation pumps, and mechanical dikes to villages and individual farms. These changes led to larger harvests, but farmers had to pay significantly more for new hybrid seeds, synthetic chemical fertilizers, chemical pesticides, irrigation infrastructure, as well as mechanized farm equipment. So let's look at a few case studies where this played out. The Green Revolution goes back as far as the 1930s. By the 1940s, it had diffused to Mexico, where high-yield varieties of wheat and maize were introduced. Keep in mind, it took thousands of years to selectively breed maize into the crop we know today. But during the Green Revolution, it took less than a decade to develop high-yield varieties that helped to alleviate hunger in developing countries like Mexico. In fact, Mexico had previously been importing wheat and corn. But by 1960, Mexico was self-sufficient without imports and even had a wheat surplus. By the 1960s, the focal point of the Third Agricultural Revolution shifted to India and other parts of Asia. In India, for example, new hybrid rice and wheat seeds first appeared in 1966. Due to the new hybrids, India's 1970 grain production was double its 1950 level. This was because these new hybrid strains produced higher yields. For example, one variety of hybrid rice exhibited genetic resistance against 15 different pests and had a growing cycle of just 110 days, which allowed farmers to produce 3 crops per year in some places. By the early 1990s, this hybrid rice, known as IR36, was the most widely grown crop on Earth. Those 3 cropping seasons led India to develop large-scale irrigation projects to try and maximize their output. But the Green Revolution did not impact all countries and regions equally. A focus on wheat, rice, and corn meant that it had only a limited impact throughout Africa, where agriculture is based on different crops such as sorghum, millet, cassava, and cowpeas. The expensive nature of the Green Revolution meant that foreign investment was important to increasing production. African soil naturally has lower fertility than soils in Asia and other regions, and the development of the appropriate fertilizers for African soil proved expensive. In addition, the genetically modified crops often lacked natural resistance to diseases and pests in the African environment, and they failed within a few years. As a result, attracting foreign investment to assist with the development of high-yield seed varieties and transportation infrastructure throughout Africa was difficult. But some progress has been made, as recent research has led to methods for producing high-yield varieties of both cassava and sorghum. And scientists have improved food production in some areas of Africa, such as Gambia. Natural wetlands have been converted to irrigated agricultural lands, allowing for year-round production of rice. But Africa has the highest population growth rate, and the Green Revolution had the smallest impact there. Today, nearly 30% of Africa's population has been affected by food insecurity. So let's end tonight by recapping some of the positive and negative changes associated with the Green Revolution. On the positive front, global food production increased dramatically on relatively the same acreage. Through genetic modification, we have crops that produce more food per plant, are resistant to pests, and have a shorter growing season. So farmers can now grow 3 crops per year. This increased food output reduced hunger, lowered death rates, and fed an expanding global population. Listen to these statistics. In 1950, 55% of people in developing countries such as India, China, and the Philippines experienced hunger. The Green Revolution grew rice production in Asia by 66% between 1965 and 1985. And recent calculations estimate that more than 80% of people living in developing countries now have adequate diets. The Green Revolution also financially benefited those who invested in it. Large landowning farmers saw an increase in production and profit. There was an expansion of cash crops that were exported to a global market. In core countries, universities and multinational corporations benefited financially from their investments in the research and development of hybrid seeds and synthetic fertilizers. At the same time, due to the increased production, there was a decline in food prices, which in turn eased the economic stress of hunger. It's believed that without the Green Revolution, prices of food in the year 2000 would have been 66% higher. Consider this. If prices were higher, it would have led to less food, lower caloric intake, higher levels of malnutrition, and greater levels of infant and child mortality. And while these positives have been well documented, we must examine the negative effects as well. The Green Revolution was expensive. In order for farmers to benefit from it, they had to spend huge sums of money on seeds, fertilizer, and machinery. So many subsistence farmers could not afford it, leading to a widening gap between the rich commercial farmers and the poor subsistence farmers. And because many large landowning farmers produced goods for profit, much of the food that was produced was exported, leading to limited food available for locals. And many of those subsistence farmers then became low-wage, landless agricultural laborers or migrated to large urban areas in search of industrial and service sector jobs. Very similar to what happened during the second agricultural revolution. On the environmental front, the limited number of hybrid and genetically modified crops led to a decline in the diversity of food crops, which can lead to several potential problems like limited nutritional diversity, as well as greater susceptibility for negative outcomes from climate change, disease, and pests. Decline in soil nutrients has become a concern as the same parcel of land is being used for double and triple crops each year, which leads to an increase in the use of chemical fertilizers. The increased use of chemical pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers increases the opportunity that chemical runoff can contaminate drinking water, lead to species extinction, as well as health issues for the population, particularly for farm workers who spray the chemicals. Increased mechanization has led to increased air pollution, and the construction of new irrigation projects has led to declines in available groundwater. Irrigation without proper drainage can lead to soil salinization, or the concentration of dissolved salts in the soil. We need to remember that there were positives and negatives of these agricultural revolutions, and that they have fundamentally changed how we as humans acquire food and live our lives. We'll continue to look at this in class. Have a good evening, everyone.